Before we begin, I have a huge favor to ask. A lot of you are watching and listening without subscribing. So if you enjoy what we do, please subscribe. Your support means a lot to our channel and the message behind it. Now, let's head back over to the Himalaya. Local authorities in Annapurna region are considering several ways to honor Nirmal Purja: a statue, a museum, even a trail carrying his name. Most of that has been warmly received. But one proposal went much further, changing the name of Annapurna itself. And that is where the tribute turned into a controversy. Locals are outraged. People keep calling these mountains sacred, and I don't think that word is enough. It doesn't resonate with people, not even close. Because when most of us hear sacred, we think of something religious: a temple, a church, a shrine, something you're supposed to respect. But that doesn't really explain the Himalaya. It doesn't explain the scale of it, the sensitivity of it, the strange psychological forces these mountains seem to have over people who have spent enough time around them. There are places up here where the air becomes so thin that your body is literally beginning to fail. Your brain slows down, your blood cannot carry enough oxygen, your muscles weaken, your judgment deteriorates. You get colder, you get dumber. And eventually, if you stay high enough for long enough, you die. And every year, people voluntarily spend enormous amounts of money trying to get there, which sounds completely insane until you've met enough people who climb mountains, because they aren't all going up there for the same reason, not even remotely. Some people climb because ordinary life has stopped making them feel anything. They've become numb, desensitized. They wake up, they go to work, they eat, they scroll, they sleep, and repeat. Nothing is technically wrong, but nothing feels particularly alive either. Some people need to put themselves somewhere where one mistake could kill them, just to feel their nervous system switch back on. That sounds horrible, but it's the real reality. Sometimes people have to get frighteningly close to losing life before the stupid little things in life start feeling valuable again. Hot food, a bed, someone waiting for you, warm fingers, being able to breathe through your nose without thinking about it. And suddenly, that's enough. Other people aren't looking for adrenaline at all. They're looking for themselves. And I know that sounds like Instagram BS, but I'm not talking about standing at a viewpoint and writing, "I found myself in the mountains." I'm talking about deliberately trying to find the breaking point of your own spirit. How cold can you become? How exhausted? How terrified? How lonely? How badly can your body beg you to stop before something inside you finally says, "No, I'm still moving"? And maybe that's what some climbers are actually searching for. Not the summit, the point where their soul breaks. They want to meet that version of themselves and find out what happens. Do they fight through it? Do they crawl? Do they panic? Do they become incredibly calm? Or do they just curl up in the snow and die? You don't know. Most of us will never know because normal life almost never asks that question of us. The mountain does. And then, some people just have a ridiculous amount of money. And honestly, why wouldn't they? If you've got $30,000 or $40,000 sitting around and your choice is go lie beside a swimming pool at some luxury resort, or go climb the Matterhorn, or walk into the Himalaya, I can understand choosing the mountain. At least you're moving, you're suffering, you're breathing cold air, you're coming home stronger than when you left. Maybe, if you come home. And there is something else these places give people that is almost impossible to explain without sounding completely ridiculous. They recharge you, not physically. Sometimes, physically, they actually destroy you. But something in you wakes up. Call it energy, call it perspective, call it mountain force, call it whatever you want. There are people who walk out of these ranges looking half dead and somehow more alive than when they entered.
And that's where the word sacred becomes very difficult. Because in Himalayan traditions, sacred it doesn't necessarily mean actually where we are from. This is a beautiful place that deserves respect. It can mean that the mountain itself has presence, identity, power, in some traditions, divinity. In the human being isn't arriving and declaring that place sacred. The person is entering something that has sacred long before they arrived. It was there.
And that's a completely different idea. Because Western mountaineering tends to use a very specific language. We conquer mountains, we bag peaks, we claim first ascents, we beat records, we stand on top. Even the language puts the human being at the center of the story. But throughout the Himalaya, that relationship has often been understood the other way around. You're not the center, you're not the visitor. And the mountain is not there because you climbed it. Even the name Himalaya tells you something. But I'm going to let our resident Sanskrit obsessive explain this because if I pronounce half of this incorrectly, I'll never hear the end of it.
Correct. Well, the Sanskrit is Himalaya. Him means snow and Alaya means dwelling, abode, residence. So the usual translation is the abode of snow, but not exactly how we say it over there. But even that English translation loses some of the feeling. The Alaya is something that, the way you carry a baby, the mother carries the baby, that's how it's carrying the snow. So you're not simply saying there's snow over there. You're describing the enormous range as a dwelling place of the snow itself, that it's carrying the snow with such love. That's what Himalaya is. Himalaya.
That's so beautiful. And once you begin understanding the mountain names, you realize people weren't randomly labeling lumps of rock. The names tell stories.
Exactly. Like Dhalgiri. Dhal, we say even to when the hair grow gray, we say it's dhala. That means it has turned white, not gray. You guys call it gray in Western world, we call it white. It name comes from Sanskrit root associated with the dazzling whiteness. You can understand it as something close to the radiant white mountain, the Masha Pushri. That means Masha is fish, Pushri is tail, fish tail, because of the shape of the summit. But culturally, that mountain means much more than its shape. It is considered sacred, particularly through its association with Shiva.
Ooh. There is another mountain where Hindu tradition says Shiva actually resides in the mountain. You don't have to travel all the way across the world. You actually just move north and west across Nepal onto the enormous Tibetan plateau. And eventually, rising strangely out of that barren landscape, you find Kailash. And this mountain is different, very different.
Very different. Kailasa, Kailash, is the abode of Shiv. Usually we call him Shiva in this part of the world, but it's Shiv. Not a mountain that somebody later dedicated to him, not simply a temple built in his honor. The tradition describes Kailasa itself as his dwelling. Shiv with Parvati, the divine family, the Ganas, the entire sacred geography surrounding them. The Shiv Purana explicitly describes Kailasa as Shiva's abode, and the Mahabharata also associated Kailasa with Shiv himself.
So, in other words, for a believer, you're not talking about climbing up to a monument dedicated to Shiv. You're talking about walking onto his residence and then eventually putting your boots on top of it. That's why this is so sensitive. Now, obviously, somebody watching this is going to say, come on, you don't literally believe Shiva is sitting inside a mountain. And that's where I think people completely misunderstand religious language. Because what does inside even mean when we're talking about a deity?
Exactly. Different schools of Hindu thought will understand this differently. Religion for us is very different than in the Western world. Someone may understand Shiv personally and as the deity who resides at Kailasa. Someone else may understand Shiva metaphysically as consciousness itself, as the supreme principle, as that through which creation appears, exists, and eventually dissolves. People often reduce the Hindu trinity into Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, creates, preserves, and destroys, as people usually know this nowadays. This is useful as an introduction, but within Shiva traditions, Shiva can be understood much more completely as the ultimate reality within which creation, preservation, and dissolution all occur in itself. So when a devotee says Shiva is in Kailash, not don't automatically reduce that to a man sitting inside a cave. They may be describing presence, the consciousness, Shakti, the power, a concentration of the divine.
So what's Shakti?
Power.
Power. Oh, that's so interesting. And that's where you start hearing something else from people who have actually gone there. They talk about energy, not metaphorically. They'll tell you feel something there. People describe Kailash as though the mountain is radiating something, a force, a vibration, or a pressure, something that doesn't feel like standing beside an ordinary piece of rock. People will tell you Kailash radiates energy, and I originally assumed that was purely religious language, except people actually went looking for it. Russian investigators took measurements around Kailash and reported what they described as an extraordinarily powerful pulsing field coming from the mountain, as if with every interval, the radiation itself seemed to pulse, almost like the mountain was breathing or like some enormous heartbeat was moving through it. They even assigned frequencies to it, around 920 gigahertz in one range and 1,650 to 1,700 gigahertz in another.
Yeah, but there is a problem. They weren't measuring it with the kind of radiation detector a nuclear physicist would normally use.
Yes.
Their methodology was called biolocation radiathesia. Their radiation intensity was recorded partly through the movement of a biolocation frame. So scientists would strongly dispute whether what they detected can legitimately be called physical radiation, or since the Himalaya is so high up, is it a combination of the thin air and the high amounts of the solar radiation exposure, which is higher up there than the sea level? I myself grew on the water of Kailash, which forms the river Satluj, and our fields were actually cultivated with the Satluj River.
Oh, that's wonderful. Beautiful as well. Well, science hasn't yet proved Shiva lives inside Kailasa. But people went there specifically looking for this supposed energy and claimed they found something. But instead, it triggered another finding. Actual nuclear physicists obtained rocks from different faces of Kailash and subjected them to X-ray, gamma, and neutron analysis. Real samples, real laboratories, real nuclear physics. They found naturally occurring radioactive elements among the rock chemistry. But they did not conclude that Kailash was emitting some lethal, unexplained radioactive field. So there are two stories sitting on top of one another, one scientifically established and one deeply disputed. And somewhere between them is the ancient belief that human beings are not supposed to go up there, simply because the amount of radiation the rocks are emitting. Shiva, the destroyer.
And more accurately, the dissolver, actually. Because destruction in Hindu philosophy isn't necessarily evil. You have to understand this difference. We can explain it some other time in more detail. If people want, they can comment underneath. A thing ends so another thing can begin. A body dies, matter changes, the universe dissolves, creation begins again. Shiva destroys illusion as well. Ego, attachment, the false idea that the individual self controls everything.
Which is a pretty terrifying deity to challenge with your ego. Because what is mountaineering at its worst? I conquered this. I stood above it. I defeated it. I put my flag there. I got the first ascent. I got the record. And Kailash is almost the perfect mountain to respond. You think you're above what? There is no confirmed modern ascent of Kailash. Not one.
Because reaching the summit is not the pilgrimage. You have to understand that. Going around the mountain is, and that's even in a different pose. We not just go around and walk around it. It's called Dandavat Pranam. We go on our knees and our head, lying down on your stomach, and go again, and then do it again and keep repeating until you go around the mountain.
Right, exactly. Pilgrims perform the Kora, or in Hindu usage, the Parikrama. You circumambulate Kailash, roughly 50 kilometers around the mountain, you don't walk over Shiva's head. You walk around the sacred center. Some Tibetan pilgrims perform full-body prostrations, as you just explained, along the route. Not just the Tibetan pilgrims. It's also the pilgrims who are all visiting from India and all over the world. They lay down completely on the stomach with hands in prayer, stand up again, hands in prayer, step forward, and lay down again. Down again and again and again and again for kilometers. Because the objective isn't, I got to the highest point. The objective is transformation, focus, resilience, perseverance, making a sacrifice to obtain what it is you desire. And that difference is absolutely critical to the story we're eventually telling about Annapurna. And at one point, one of the greatest mountaineers who has ever lived was apparently given an opportunity almost nobody else had. Reinhold Messner, first person to climb all 14 8,000-meter mountains, and Everest without supplemental oxygen. A man who spent his entire life going where people told him human beings couldn't go. In the mid-1980s, Chinese authorities offered him the possibility of climbing Kailash, and he said no. Think about who we're talking about. Messner saying, no, I'm not climbing that. And later he explained that after seeing the devotion of pilgrims around Kailash, climbing it would have amounted to sacrilege. A 2024 interview describes him how seeing pilgrims making the Kora, some crawling or moving on their knees, convinced him to abandon the idea. Another widely reported version of his position is essentially, if we conquer this mountain, we conquer something in people's souls. And that might be one of the most important things any mountaineer has ever not done. Because Messner understood something. Just because you can climb something doesn't mean you have the right to. And it doesn't mean you have the right to change its ancient meaning and names. Whenever you have a mountain nobody is allowed to climb, eventually somebody tells a story about someone who tried. And Kailash has one particular story that refuses to die. You've probably heard some version of it online. Russian climbers. Sometimes they're called Siberian climbers. Sometimes there are 4, and sometimes the number changes. They ignored the warnings, went on to Kailash, crossed some invisible point, and something happened to their bodies. They started aging fast. Their hair, their nails, their faces, as though time itself had accelerated around them. And they came down terrified, and according to the darkest version of the story, they were dead within roughly a year.
And we need to separate story from the evidence.
Because I went looking for these people, their names, the expedition records, the photographs, the medical reports, anything. And this is where the story becomes weird for a completely different reason. There isn't a properly documented climbing expedition matching the viral version. One of the older traceable accounts comes from a 27 article about Russian doctor Ernst Muldashev, who traveled to Kailash region in around 1999. The article quotes a story supposedly told by a Siberian mountaineer. The claim was that climbers went beyond a certain point, suddenly appeared to age by decades, and died about a year later. But no names, no medical files, no expedition log establishing that it had happened. And Muldashev's own expedition did not summit Kailash. But here's what fascinates me. Somebody created that story, or somebody experienced something that eventually became that story, and it has survived because it fits perfectly into what people already believe about this mountain. Despite not having enough evidence or reports to prove the story isn't just another tale. The moral of the story is don't go up there. You also hear pilgrims say their hair and nails seem to grow unusually fast around Kailash. Same problem. There are stories everywhere. There is no good evidence that Kailash somehow accelerated biological time. Altitude can absolutely do bizarre things to the human body. Dehydration, hypoxia, sleep deprivation, changes in perception, confusion, and a distorted sense of time. But that's very different from physically aging 20 years in 2 days. So scientifically, maybe do the pilgrimage and see for yourself.
Kailash was sacred first. The prohibition comes from the reverence and not fear that some unknown radiation will kill you. No, it's not because of that.
Yeah. Interestingly, tradition does contain a story of somebody reaching Kailash, but even that story doesn't sound anything like mountaineering. The Tibetan yogi Milarepa, in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there are legends connecting Milarepa with the summit of Kailash, but he doesn't strap on crampons, fix ropes, and plant a flag. One tradition describes him reaching it through spiritual power. In retellings with traveling on rays of sunlight, kind of like astro travel, which may be the most Kailash thing imaginable. The only guide tradition allows onto the summit doesn't conquer it. He transcends the entire concept of climbing. So we've drilled into the earth, blown the tops off mountains, put roads through forests, built hotels at places people once considered unreachable. There isn't much on this planet human beings look at and say, no, we could, but we won't. Masha Pushre, Kailash, two summits human beings have largely agreed to leave alone. And that brings us to the mountain at the center of this controversy, one of the most feared on earth, Annapurna. So what does it mean to take a mountain carrying centuries of sacred meaning and attach the name of a modern human being to it?
The name comes from Sanskrit. Anna doesn't mean food, which the English will translate as food. Anna for us is the one that gives you life. It not necessarily banana or apples or oranges. An is in whole. We call it an, the grain, the nourishment. And Purna means it gives you the fulfillment of having food. So it gives you Annapurna. Annapurna is also the name of the goddess associated with the nourishment and food. And so when you say Annapurna, you're not merely identifying a mountain. You are invoking an old cultural idea, the giver of the nourishment, the one who makes sure there is enough for whole humanity.
Right. Which is almost absurd when you look at it because Annapurna doesn't look nurturing at all. It looks murderous. There's avalanches, seracs, ice cliffs, storms, one of the highest mountains on earth, a place where human beings have died in horrifying numbers. And yet the name is basically about feeding life.
Yeah, ask that guy Anurag Malu, I think, who survived on Annapurna. Is it giving or is taking? He will tell you. Because the name didn't originate from mountaineering. That's important. The mountain had meaning before the climbers started measuring themselves against it.
Remember that sentence, because later in the story, someone is going to suggest changing the name, not removing Annapurna completely, adding something in front of it, the name of a man. And depending on how you view mountains, that proposal is either an extraordinary tribute to one of Nepal's most famous climbers, or it completely misunderstands what these mountains are. But we're not there yet, because before we can talk about that man, we need to go down, out of the death zone, past the glaciers and past the cliffs, into the valleys underneath Annapurna. Because people actually live there. And living in the Himalaya is very different from flying in, climbing a mountain, taking a summit photo, and then leaving. From a summit video, the Himalaya can look almost empty. There's lots of snow, rock, sky, one climber moving through it, but descend far enough and the mountains become crowded with life. Terraced fields cut into slopes that don't look like they should be farmable. Children walk roads, tourists complain about hiking once. Families grow food on tiny pieces of land, and livestock moves between villages. Monsoon rain tears roads apart, landslides isolate communities. Tourism arrives and tourism disappears. Young people leave, older people stay, and towering over all of it are mountains that the rest of the world treats as adventure destinations. For the people underneath them, they're home, they're their weather, they're their water, they're their income, their danger, and it's their religion, their history. Sometimes they are their death.
And that's another reason outsiders misunderstand the word sacred. When something shapes your water, your agriculture, your seasons, your mythology, well, we don't consider it mythology, but the Western world does, and your survival, religion and daily life are not easily separated.
Exactly. If you live thousands of kilometers away, Annapurna can be a bucket list mountain. If you live underneath Annapurna, it's a thing that's been staring through your family history for generations. And in one village beneath these mountains, a boy grew up who would eventually become so famous that his own local government would ask Nepal to attach his name to Annapurna itself. His name was Nirmal Purja, but most of the world would come to know him as Nims Dai.
So who gets to decide what these mountains are called then?
Well, somebody had to name these places, or at least somebody had to decide which name would eventually appear on the map. And those are not always the same thing. A mountain can have a name for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. And then somebody suddenly arrives from somewhere else, measures it, puts it on a map, and suddenly the rest of the world starts calling it something completely different. The most obvious example is sitting right in the middle of the Himalaya, Mount Everest, the one nobody can ignore. George Mallory sums up this obsession perfectly. It's just there. Ancient mountain people knew this was the highest mountain. They could see visually that it was. Everest was a part of a sacred landscape inhabited by powerful beings. It was written in scripture centuries ago that the mountain is associated with Chomolungma, one of the 5 sisters of long life. It is understood as her abode. Tibetan ideas of sacred mountains and powerful places predate Buddhism and were later incorporated into Tibetan Buddhist traditions.
Which, of course, wasn't originally called Everest.
Right. And this gets strange because the highest mountain on earth already had names. In Tibetan, it is Chomolungma.
Yep, it's called Chomolungma in Tibetan, usually interpreted as something along the lines of Goddess Mother of the World. And that name matters because, again, you're seeing the mountain described not simply as geography, but as something feminine. Remember, feminine, maternal, divine, and Everest is actually, even in English, is not Everest, is Everest.
Yes. And then British surveyors came along in 1850 and saw it, tried to measure it from 100 miles away because they were not able to enter Nepal at that time. They called it Peak XV for a while. Then finally, an Indian mathematician, Radhanath Sikdar, was able to measure it exactly using trigonometry calculations as a part of the British surveyor team. In 1856, he calculated it to be 8,840 meters and eventually named it after George Everest, a British surveyor. Everest, to be exact, a guy who didn't climb the mountain, didn't discover the mountain, and apparently wasn't even particularly enthusiastic about having his name attached to it. Yet today, billions of people know the word Everest. Very few know Chomolungma, and even fewer know it as Sagarmatha. Think about that for a second. A goddess became a British man's surname. And why Everest?
Because Andrew Waugh decided to honor his old boss, Sir George Everest, the former Surveyor General of India.
Not because the local name disappeared, but because one name acquired more global power than the other. Nepalian people had an official ancient mountain name of their own, Sagarmatha.
A Nepali Sanskrit derived name generally understood as something like Sagarmatha means not really head of the sky. It means the elevation, the forehead, Matha is forehead, that is towards the ocean. So I cannot really put it in words what it is, but in reality it is.
Forehead.
The forehead of the mountain, the elevation that is facing the ocean.
That's beautiful. So one mountain can carry several identities simultaneously. Chomolungma, Sagarmatha, Everest, and whichever one you choose actually says something about whose perspective you're looking from. So why is there so much obsession surrounding Everest or Sagarmatha or Chomolungma? Well, simply, it is just there. The highest point. It always has been so vast and powerful looking, so naturally one just wants to receive its powers. But Annapurna is different. Nobody needs to recover some forgotten indigenous name from underneath a colonial one. The traditional name is already there, Annapurna. And that's why what happens later in the story becomes so sensitive, because nobody is proposing to remove the name of a British surveyor. They're talking about modifying a name that already comes from the cultural and spiritual world of the Himalaya. So the name they want to attach to it is Nirmal Purja. And you need to see the place he actually came from, because Nirmal Purja didn't grow up looking at the Himalaya through a Netflix documentary. He grew up underneath it. Go west from Kathmandu, past Pokhara, into Myagdi district. Follow the Kali Gandaki Valley north, and eventually you reach a village called Dana. This is where Nirmal Purja was born. And when you hear that somebody came from the Himalaya, it's tempting to imagine they must have grown up climbing enormous mountains from childhood. That's not really his story. Nims did not spend his childhood preparing to become the world's most famous high-altitude climber. His family wasn't raising the next Himalayan celebrity. They were living a normal life in a place that just happened to sit beneath some of the most extraordinary mountains on earth. And that distinction matters because from Dana, Annapurna wasn't an achievement. It wasn't a record. It wasn't even a career. It was part of the landscape of home.
Which makes what eventually happened much more personal.
Much more. Because decades later, the government of the very community where Nims grew up would sit down in a meeting and seriously discuss whether one of the greatest mountains on earth should carry his name. But to understand why they would even consider doing that, you have to understand what this boy from Dana eventually became. And here is the strange thing about Nims Dai. If you were trying to invent the perfect background for the man who would eventually bulldoze through Himalayan mountaineering records, you probably wouldn't write his story this way. Because for most of his early life, Nirmal Purja wasn't a professional climber at all. He became a Gurkha, then he did something even harder. He became the first Gurkha in generations to pass selection for Britain's Special Boat Service, an elite special forces unit. This is incredibly hard, and it's arduous training. Definitely a huge feat. And somewhere during that life, he discovered the mountains, not as a religion, not as history. His colleagues would often ask if he's from Nepal, had he climbed Mount Everest. It made him feel a little embarrassed that he hadn't climbed or experienced the very mountain his own country was famous for. He decided he was up for a test. And after all, traditional mountaineering has long been regarded as a pursuit reserved for some of the most fittest, toughest, and most resilient athletes in the world. And once Nims discovered that test, he apparently wasn't interested in taking it normally. You already know the achievements. Project Possible, 14 8,000 meter peaks. He did hold the record at one point. He did K2 in winter, the historical approach to the summit with all the entire Nepali team walking hand in hand to the summit together on K2. He has 57 successful ascents of 8,000 meter peaks, 29 without oxygen. Nimsdai Foundation supported the Sherpa communities and also creating support and a new life for former war veterans. He was also an activist. He was working on so many more campaigns, especially protecting the mountain environments and the cleanup activities. His records completely changed the way people looked at Nepal and Nepali mountaineers. But more importantly, what he meant to the normal, ordinary person across the globe. He inspired them in so many ways, people in different environments, just through his actions and words, and importantly, for this story. So what is the significance of Annapurna? Well, Project Possible began on Annapurna, where he first said giving up is not in the blood. Years later, after Nims died on Broad Peak in 2026, his home community in Nepal began discussing how he should be remembered. A statue, a museum, a trail carrying his name, all understandable. But then they went one step further.
They wanted to rename Annapurna.
Not replace the name completely, but change Annapurna I to Nimsdai Annapurna. And suddenly, this isn't just about honoring a great climber anymore. Because remember what we have just spent this entire story understanding. These names already mean something.
Like we discussed earlier, Annapurna comes from Sanskrit. Most of our names come from Sanskrit. Most of our names mean something. Annapurna comes from Sanskrit. Anna, food, nourishment. Purna means full, complete. It provides you nourishment. Annapurna is the divine giver of nourishment. This is not simply a geographical label.
And that's where I think the real controversy begins because Nims absolutely deserves to be remembered. But does remembering one extraordinary human being require changing the identity of an ancient Himalayan mountain? Opponents emphasize that Purja's legacy can be properly celebrated through memorials, museums, and statues without rewriting the historic name of a mountain, especially when that mountain's name was never colonial to begin with. Everest is complicated because an older Tibetan name was overshadowed by the surname of a British surveyor because it was more popular. Annapurna is the opposite. Annapurna is already the traditional name. So this isn't reclaiming a mountain, it's adding a modern human being to something that was already complete.
And perhaps that's the distinction. Great climbers become part of a mountain's history. Like Abruzzi is added to the route, not to K2 or any other, like Nanga Parbat or, any other thing. It's just a route. They don't necessarily need to become part of its name.
Exactly. Build a museum, build a statue, name a mountaineering school after Nims Dai, fund young Nepali climbers in his name. But Annapurna, Nims made history on Annapurna. I'm not convinced that means Annapurna should now carry his name. Because maybe there are some mountains where the greatest act of respect is knowing when not to put ourselves on them. So, what do you think? Nimsdai Annapurna? Or simply Annapurna?
Annapurna.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm Rima. This is Reembok Arcane. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We need your support, and we'll see you on the next one. Comment below.